That Saturday was supposed to be my escape from the office grind. A rare day off to spend with my wife, Julia. It was just a trip to the grocery store, nothing special, but these little routines had become my sanctuary, something I looked forward to all week. We were hand in hand, walking past the rows of canned goods when my phone buzzed. I didn't even have to look. Julia and I shared the same ringtone for one person. Kevin, our boss. Kevin was demanding, to put it mildly. Calls at all hours, sudden projects, urgent reports. He was the kind of boss who believed personal time was just a phrase for people who weren't married to their work. So, when I picked up the call, I was already braced for a bombshell. Instead, Kevin's voice sounded excited. I glanced at Julia, who raised her brows in surprise. Just landed a major deal, he announced, almost shouting. 6 figures, and it's all thanks to you too. This could mean promotions, raises, good news all around. It was surreal hearing Kevin so pleased. I almost didn't believe it. And listen, he continued, to celebrate, I'm throwing a party tomorrow night. You two absolutely have to be there. Bring your brother Brian too. I insist. When he hung up, I stood there stunned. Julia's eyes sparkled as she beamed at me. So, are we going? She asked, nudging my arm playfully. I grinned, nodding, unable to hold back my own excitement. But as we continued down the aisle, something gnawed at me. Brian, why had Kevin asked me to bring him along? That detail hung around like a shadow, dimming my mood. Recently, Julia had been mentioning Brian far more often than usual, almost finding reasons to bring him up. She had never been all that close to him, so the change caught my attention, even if I tried not to think much of it. So, are you going to call Brian? Julia's voice pulled me from my thoughts, breaking the silence between us. I shrugged, frowning slightly. I don't think he'll want to come. She flashed me a look, half disappointment, half something else. Come on, it's just a party, she said. Kevin even said to bring him. I shrugged it off, my gaze shifting to the card. But the more I thought about it, the stranger her insistence felt. The nagging thoughts crept back in, unwelcome but persistent. Had I imagined the way she seemed to light up when Brian was around? Her laugh, somehow warmer and more free than it was with me? Or those moments she'd ask me about him, unprompted, as if fishing for details? I didn't like where my mind was going, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The rest of the walk was quiet, her gaze darting my way every few minutes, as if trying to read my silence. Back home, I caught myself thinking how absurd I'd been to let a simple invitation stir up such doubts. Brian was my brother, for God's sake. We'd been close for as long as I could remember, through every up and down. If there was one person I trusted implicitly, it was him. I had a solid marriage and a good brother, and there was no reason to let a stray comment shake that. As I set my keys on the kitchen counter, Julia darted straight to the bedroom wardrobe. I followed her halfway up the stairs, only to hear her calling my name from the closet. Babe, what do you think? The red dress or the green one? She yelled out, voice muffled behind the doors. I leaned against the doorframe, watching her shuffle hangers with a bit more energy than usual. This wasn't unusual for her, I told myself. We didn't go out often, so of course she wanted to look her best. I think whatever you pick will be great, I said, trying to ease the decision process. She didn't even hear me. She was already too engrossed, pulling dress after dress off the hangers and holding them against herself in the mirror. It was like she was preparing for some life-changing event. I watched her for a moment, a little entertained by the spectacle. She was talking to herself, even flipping through shoes, holding up jewelry, as if she was mentally planning every angle. As she flitted about, I decided to call Brian and fill him in. The phone barely rang once before he answered. Hey man, what's up? He said, his voice bright, almost a little too bright. Hey Brian. So, here's the thing. Kevin's throwing a party tomorrow. He wants us all there to celebrate the big contract win. There was a pause on the line. I thought maybe he'd hesitate, knowing how he feels about work parties, but he surprised me. That's cool, I'll definitely be there, he said with a low chuckle. So, is Julia going too? The way he asked struck me as strange, too casual, like he was forcing nonchalance. The line went quiet as I replayed his words. Yeah, I replied, she's coming with me? Great, he said. He sounded amused. It'll be good to see you guys. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that maybe he was just eager for a night out. Well, we'll have dinner here beforehand, so just come over early tomorrow. After I hung up, I started back down the hall, only to hear Julia call out again. So, is Brian coming? Yeah, he's coming, I answered, leaning against the wall outside the bathroom. Yes, baby, she yelled, practically giddy. I stared at the ceiling, letting out a long sigh. Her excitement about Brian's attendance shouldn't have bothered me, but it did. Shaking my head, I tried to dismiss the creeping doubt and focused on the shower. Standing under the warm water in the shower, I tried to wash away the absurd thoughts that had been creeping in since Kevin's call. But each time I pushed them out, they circled back, as insistent as the pulsing of the water. What was I thinking? Brian was my brother. I repeated it to myself, almost like a chant, trying to drown out the nagging voice that kept circling back to Julia's bright smile when she heard he'd be there. And Brian's, well, I didn't know what it was, but his tone when he asked if she'd be there, it just seemed off. But I reminded myself that I was likely paranoid. I was overthinking this. Night fell, and as usual, Julia and I climbed into bed together. She snuggled up to me, her voice soft, excited, as we talked about the party. She was looking forward to it, imagining the lights, the music, everyone we knew coming together for a night of celebration. I pictured it too, trying to let that image ease my mind as she chattered on, listing off names of people she hoped would show up, wondering aloud if Kevin's, famous, or Derv's would make an appearance. Her laughter was warm and relaxed. I tried to mirror it, but something held me back. Eventually, her breathing settled, and she drifted off, her head resting on my shoulder. I closed my eyes, hoping for sleep to come just as easily. But in the dead of night, I woke up with a start, a strangled yell caught in my throat. Cold sweat slicked my skin, and the disorientation was instant and overwhelming. I've been dreaming, no, not dreaming, nightmaring. Flashes of the party, the echoing thud of bass, a flash of Brian's face turning toward me, a strange, mocking smile. Hey! Julia's voice pulled me back to reality, and I turned to see her sitting up beside me, eyes wide with alarm. What happened? You were screaming, she said, her voice thick with sleep and fear. It was just a nightmare, I managed to say, still trying to shake the remnants of it from my mind. I kept my tone light, trying to brush it off, even as the weight of it clung to me, like an oily film I couldn't rub off. She let out a sigh, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Here, she murmured, reaching over to her nightstand. She handed me a small blue pill and a glass of water. These help when I have nightmares. They'll calm you down, she said, watching me closely. I took the pill, grateful for her tenderness, but my eyes lingered on her face for a moment. She seemed concerned, almost as though she'd been waiting for something like this to happen. But that was ridiculous, I told myself. I downed the pill, trying to let the growing fog around my thoughts take over. As I drifted back into sleep, her face lingered in my mind, but not with the softness I usually remembered. There was something else there, a glint of relief, or maybe something darker. But before I could make sense of it, I was out. I woke up to Julia's voice ringing through the house. Finally, this day has come, she called out, her tone practically brimming with excitement. I pried one eye open, groaning slightly as I took in the time on the clock. 9 a.m. Every bone in my body begged me to roll over and stay in bed a little longer. I could already feel a dull headache creeping in, probably thanks to the nightmare that had rattled me last night. But as much as I wanted to stay wrapped in my sheets, I knew that Julia's enthusiasm wasn't going to let me have that luxury. Today's going to be great, I muttered to myself, forcing a smile as I swung my legs out of bed. It's just a party, I reminded myself. With that thought, I shook off the heaviness lingering from the dream and tried to get myself into the spirit of things. The day dragged by, as if the hours themselves were conspiring to keep me in suspense. By the time 6 p.m. rolled around, I felt more ready to crawl back into bed than go to a party. But I looked over at Julia, and her face was practically glowing. She'd spent hours picking out her dress and fussing with her hair, all with an excitement that bordered on nervous energy. I shook off my fatigue and followed her out the door, where Brian was already waiting by the car, bouncing on his heels as if he were the one this party was being thrown for. He grinned as he saw us, opening the door for Julia with a bit of a flourish. "Ready, guys?" he asked, his eyes darting to Julia a little longer than I was comfortable with. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile as I took the driver's seat, keeping my tone as light as I could manage. The drive was half an hour, and the whole time I could hear Julia and Brian chatting animatedly in the back seat, laughing about old memories, inside jokes I barely remembered, and plans for a weekend road trip they were planning together for some time soon. I felt like a spectator in my own car, my responses sparse and my thoughts drifting. Finally, we reached Kevin's place. I was surprised at how lively it was. The music was pounding, echoing down the street, and every parking space was packed. People were everywhere, drinks in hand, leaning against cars, chatting in groups. It was more like a festival than a simple office celebration. I hadn't expected this kind of turnout for an office party, but it looked like Kevin was pulling out all the stops. "Looks like half the town's here," Brian joked as we climbed out, glancing around with a grin. Julia laughed, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe it either, but I caught that spark of excitement in her eyes. She seemed so at ease, so at home among this chaos. As we entered the house, Kevin's voice boomed out over the noise, cutting through the music. "There they are! The people who made this all possible," he shouted, gesturing toward us with both arms. Immediately, heads turned, and a chorus of applause filled the room. Faces I barely recognized clapped and cheered, raising their glasses as if we'd just saved the world. Julia's smile widened, and she reached for my hand, squeezing it as she whispered, "See? This is what all the hard work was for." Then, out of nowhere, Brian raised his hands and shouted over the crowd, "Yeah, it's us." His voice was loud, playful, and his enthusiasm was contagious enough to draw a few laughs. It didn't matter that he didn't even work with us. He played along, and people loved it. He was so at ease, reveling in the attention as though he belonged here more than I did. For a second, I felt a weird twinge of annoyance, a strange sort of intrusion I couldn't explain. But I let it pass, telling myself I was just reading too much into things. Julia was beaming, Brian was in high spirits, and everyone around us was celebrating. It was time to relax and just enjoy the night. The party was in full swing, and for a while, I allowed myself to get caught up in the energy. The beat of the music pulsed through the house, laughter spilled from every corner, and even Kevin seemed more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. I almost forgot about the strange tension I'd been feeling all day. The nightmare, Julia's excitement, Brian's enthusiasm. All of it faded into the background as we danced, drank, and cheered. But then, a sudden wail of sirens broke through the music, followed by a harsh flashing of red and blue lights outside the windows. The police had arrived. People paused mid-dance, laughter fading as murmurs filled the room. I spotted Kevin near the entryway, his face dropping as he realized what was happening. Kevin's neighbors had always had it out for him, but it still felt like an abrupt intrusion. The police entered, stern and unimpressed, demanding that the music be turned down. "You've got neighbors trying to sleep," one of the officers announced over the dwindling hum of music. "This party needs to quiet down or it's over." Kevin, always the charmer, went into full negotiation mode. I watched him, hands gesturing animatedly as he assured them that things would calm down and that it was just a harmless celebration. After a few minutes, the officers relented, but they gave him a stern warning to keep it low or risk shutting the whole thing down. When the police finally left, a collective sigh of relief rippled through the crowd. Kevin, playing off the whole thing with a grand gesture, flicked the music back on, only slightly quieter this time. People laughed, clapping and cheering for him, as if he'd performed a miracle. The party resumed, the tension easing into laughter, and soon it was like the interruption had never happened. Kevin's house was massive, with 3 floors packed full of people, each one brimming with laughter, chatter, and groups that had formed around drinks and conversation. Everywhere I looked, I saw friends, colleagues, and even some faces I didn't recognize, all lost in the joy of the night. I found myself drifting back into the fun, and soon I was on the dance floor, letting myself get pulled into the rhythm. I was lost in the moment until, Through the crowd, I caught sight of Julia at the bar with Brian. I paused, watching as they laughed together, each holding a drink. I felt the faint tug of something uneasy, but brushed it off as the remnants of my earlier paranoia. She was just letting loose, enjoying herself. Besides, I didn't want to be that guy, the one who watches his wife's every move at a party. But now, as I sit here writing these lines, that moment stands before my eyes, sharp and unrelenting. Julia's laughter, a little louder than usual, her hand lightly touching Brian's shoulder as she leaned in to respond to his words. And Brian, he was so attentive, pouring her a drink, smiling in a way that seemed even too comfortable. I can't stop thinking about the process, because if I had taken away from my wife at that moment, what happened next would not have happened. But I didn't. I let her be, told myself she was just having fun. If only I'd known how wrong I was. I hadn't realized how quickly time had passed. The music, the laughter, the endless stream of people all blurred together. And before I knew it, an hour had gone by. Julia had last been at the bar, laughing with Brian, and at some point, she must have wandered off, but I hadn't noticed. Why would I? We were in Kevin's house, surrounded by friends and colleagues. Nothing could happen to her here. But then, around 30 minutes later, a sudden commotion broke through the music, a mixture of shouting and laughter drifting down from the second floor. I could just make out someone yelling over the noise, their voice echoing through the hall. "Everyone, come here. Someone's making love in one of the rooms." At first, I didn't think much of it. This party had been wild enough already, and people were always looking for something to laugh about. Curiosity got the better of me, though, and I figured I'd join in on the joke. I made my way up the stairs, trailing behind a few others who were already heading up, phones in hand, ready to catch whatever spectacle was unfolding. I heard more laughter, people whispering excitedly to each other as they gathered outside one of the rooms, crowding the doorway. But then I heard it. My last name. Hamsters. "What you doing?" At first, I thought I'd misheard. Surely, they weren't talking about my family. But then the laughter swelled, people pointing at the room, craning their necks to get a better view. A strange sense of dread crawled up my spine, and I pushed through the crowd, my heart pounding harder with each step. "Let me through!" I shouted, my voice barely cutting through the laughter and the low hum of murmuring. Finally, I reached the front of the crowd and saw it. There, under the tangled mess of covers, were my wife, Julia, and Brian, both half-hidden but unmistakably without clothes. Their faces were flushed, Brian's arm draped protectively over her as they clutched the sheets, trying to shield themselves from the cameras and the people pointing and laughing from the doorway. Their clothes lay strewn across the floor, discarded like afterthoughts. They both looked up, horror flashing across their faces. "Get out of here and shut the door," Julia screamed, her voice breaking, but that only made the crowd laugh harder. They were helpless, exposed in every sense of the word, the room filled with the sound of laughter and mocking comments. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. My mouth was dry, my stomach twisted into knots so tight I thought I'd be sick. I wanted to look away, to do anything but face the brutal reality unfolding before me. Yet, I was rooted to the spot, a strange sense of shame washing over me, like I was the one who'd been stripped bare in front of everyone. Every gaze, every pointed finger and jeering laugh burned into me, as if I was as exposed as they were. I felt my hands shaking, my vision blurring as anger, humiliation, and confusion crashed over me like waves. The scene felt unreal, like some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake from. I'd been blindsided, humiliated in the most public, unforgiving way. I don't know how long I stood there, watching them plead with people to leave, begging the onlookers to stop filming, but I couldn't move. I stood there, my chest heaving, the shock freezing me in place until rage broke through like a dam. The crowd behind us was still laughing, whispering, their phones still pointed at the open door, as if they were watching a scene from a movie. I couldn't take it anymore. "Get out! All of you, get out!" I bellowed, my voice echoing off the walls. The laughter faded, some people shrinking back, but a few lingered, phone still recording. I slammed the door shut, sealing out the gawking eyes and whispers. Turning back, I marched up to the bed, my fists clenched so tightly I could feel my nails digging into my palms. I grabbed the blanket and yanked it off. They ran away, unclothed and stunned, grabbing at each other before diving to hide. "So this is why you two kept talking about each other," I shouted, the words choking me as they spilled out. "All those times you laughed together, all those little conversations, it was all leading to this?" My voice rose with each word, the anger clawing its way out of me, louder and rawer than I'd ever felt. Julia's face went pale, her eyes wide and brimming with tears as she clutched a pillow to her chest. Brian, fumbling for his pants, wouldn't even meet my gaze. "I never thought I'd see this with my own eyes," I spat, my voice low, trembling. I turned away, fighting to catch my breath. But as I did, I noticed the door was cracked open again, someone peering in with their phone still held up, recording every moment. I almost laughed bitterly at the sight. It didn't matter now. Whatever shame I'd felt in that first instant was burned away, replaced by a seething anger that numbed every other emotion. I didn't care who saw. I didn't care what anyone thought. Brian and Julia scrambled, grabbing their clothes, their voices reduced to stammering apologies I didn't want to hear. Their panicked whispers only fueled my fury, each desperate apology a reminder of the trust they'd shattered. I ripped the door open again, the force of it echoing down the hall. People were still lingering, watching, half shocked, half amused, and I felt my fury building into a roar. I stumbled out of the room, needing to escape, needing to breathe, feeling like the walls themselves were closing in. Footsteps sounded behind me, and then I heard Kevin's voice calling out, "Wait, hey, hold on." He caught up to me as I reached the stairs, grabbing my shoulder. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice low, his hand gripping my arm. "I had no idea, man. I'm here for you. I'm on your side." I looked at him, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I don't know what I just saw in there," I muttered, the words catching in my throat, sounding as foreign as they felt. Kevin's face twisted with anger as he turned back toward the room. "What the hell were you two thinking?" he shouted, his voice carrying down the hall, full of a cold fury I hadn't expected. "What did you think this was, some joke? Why didn't you tell him sooner? Why didn't you get out of his life before you did this to him?" A strange comfort washed over me at his anger. At least someone here understood. At least one person was furious with them on my behalf. It felt like a small lifeline in the middle of a nightmare, a shred of dignity in a world turned upside down. But I couldn't take another second in that house. The walls, the faces staring at me, the sounds of them, my wife and my brother, whispering in the room upstairs. I couldn't bear it. I stumbled down the stairs, ignoring the people who parted as I passed, and out the front door, barely able to see through the red haze clouding my vision. Reaching my car, I threw myself into the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel as if it were the only anchor I had left. Without looking back, I pulled out, the party and Kevin's house fading in my rearview mirror as I drove off into the night, the sounds of laughter and betrayal echoing in my mind. I don't remember how long I drove, or even where I was going, but I do remember the speed. The engine roared as I floored it, the world outside blurring into a streak of lights and shadows. I knew I was going too fast, cutting corners, burning through intersections without a second thought. But in that moment, none of it mattered. I felt like I was trying to outrun the memory of what I'd seen, as if speed alone could somehow erase it. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw the flash of blue and red lights. A split second later, the sirens pierced the air. I cursed under my breath, clenching the wheel tighter. Part of me wanted to keep going, to just keep pressing forward until I could find a place where none of this existed. But the police car was right behind me, and I knew that running would only make everything worse. Reluctantly, I eased up on the gas and pulled over to the side of the road. The officer approached my window, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. I could see the disappointment in his eyes as he took in my disheveled state, the mess of emotions scrawled across my face. "Sir, you were speeding way over the limit," he said, his tone sharp but controlled. And then He leaned in a little closer, his nose wrinkling slightly as he caught the faint scent of alcohol lingering on my breath. I knew what was coming. I'd had a few drinks at the party, but I hadn't stopped to think about it. Everything had happened so fast. My mind had been somewhere else entirely. But none of that would matter now. The officer asked me to step out of the car, and I complied, numb and resigned. The field sobriety test was over in minutes, and his expression grew graver as he finished. "You're over the limit, sir. I'm going to need to take you in." As he cuffed me and guided me to the back of his car, something inside me broke. The frustration, the anger, the betrayal. All of it came rushing out, and I found myself spilling the entire story, barely able to get the words out through the choking sobs. "My wife, she was with my brother," I stammered, my voice cracking. At the party, everyone saw. I didn't know what to do." The officer looked at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes softening. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I really am." The rest of the ride was a blur, my face pressed against the cold glass as I struggled to keep my emotions in check. They issued me a ticket, and then they told me they'd be taking my car to the impound lot. Before I knew it, I was standing alone on my front porch, watching the squad car pull away, leaving me in the silent, empty darkness. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, feeling the emptiness settle over me like a weight I couldn't shake. The quiet felt deafening, pressing down on me with the full weight of what had happened. My thoughts, my body, all of it snapped. I roared into the emptiness, my voice echoing through the empty house, raw and ragged. Why? Why did this happen? My hand found the first thing in reach, a family photo on the shelf beside the door, and I hurled it across the room. The glass shattered, fragments scattering across the floor, reflecting tiny glints of light like mocking stars. I moved from one picture to the next, ripping down every frame, tearing apart every memory. Every smiling photo, every frozen moment of happiness turned into fuel for the anger burning inside me. My wedding photos, vacation snapshots, birthdays, they all lay in ruins around me, fragments of glass and paper scattered like broken promises across the floor. The fury consumed me. I tore into the bedroom, yanking open her closet, grabbing her clothes by the handful, and throwing them to the floor. I found scissors and began slicing through the fabric, shredding the dresses she had once worn with that confident smile, cutting apart the blouses she wore to work. Each cut, each rip felt like a release, like I was clawing back some small piece of control over a life that had spun so wildly out of my grasp. When there was nothing left to destroy, I collapsed onto the bed, my chest heaving as the weight of it all crashed down around me. I don't know how long I lay there, staring blankly at the ceiling, trying to process what I'd just torn apart. At some point, exhaustion must have taken over, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a thunderous pounding on the front door. I sat up, disoriented, the chaos of the room surrounding me like an accusation. My mind felt like it was caught in quicksand, everything sinking slowly into fragments I couldn't quite make sense of. The knocking grew louder, harder, like whoever was on the other side was intent on breaking down the door. I stumbled to my feet, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and swung the door open, half prepared for another confrontation with the police. But instead, there stood Julia, her face streaked with tears, her hair wild and unkempt. The moment our eyes met, she let out a strangled cry and stormed inside. "This is all your fault," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Because of you, everyone's making fun of me. Do you know what they're saying? You ruined everything." I stood there, stunned, unable to wrap my mind around the twisted irony of her words. My fault? She had been the one under the covers with my brother, and now I was the one who'd ruined her life. I felt something snap inside of me, and before I knew it, I was shouting back. "You think this is my fault? If you hadn't thrown yourself at Brian, none of this would have happened. You destroyed us, Julia. You, not me." She opened her mouth to retort, but then her gaze shifted to the wreckage around her. The shards of broken frames, the shredded remains of her clothes, the torn photos scattered like confetti. Her face twisted in anger and horror, and her eyes shot back to me, blazing with fury. Look at this. You went completely insane, she screamed. You destroyed everything. How could you be so stupid? I couldn't bear it any longer. I took a deep breath, the air heavy with a mix of bitterness and heartbreak, and I slammed the door in her face. But she kept pounding, her voice rising in a shrill scream. Get out of my house. This is my grandfather's house, and you're not welcome here anymore, she yelled through the door. Her words hit like a punch to the gut. I had poured years of my life into this place, every corner filled with memories I thought would last a lifetime, and now she was casting me out like I meant nothing. I ripped the door open, unleashing all the anger I'd been holding back. This is all your fault, I shouted, my voice trembling. You betrayed me with my own brother. You were the one under the covers with him, with people filming you, and somehow, this is all on me? Why, Julia? Why would you do that to me? She glared back, silent now, her face pale and hard. Leave by tonight, she said, her voice low, cold. She turned on her heel, throwing one last look of disgust over her shoulder, and walked away. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the empty doorway, her words ringing in my ears. The silence was so thick it felt suffocating, pressing down on me until I couldn't breathe. Finally, I forced myself to move, grabbing my things, stuffing clothes into a bag in a daze. The reality of it all hit in waves, each one colder and heavier than the last. I was losing my home, my marriage, my family, all in the span of a single, horrible night. When I went to leave, I instinctively reached for my car keys, only to remember that the police had impounded my car. A bitter laugh escaped my throat, tinged with the absurdity of it all. With a trembling hand, I pulled out my phone and called a taxi, my voice hollow as I gave them my address. While I waited, the rage simmered up again, uncontainable. I looked around at the things we'd once shared, the memories and possessions we'd collected together, and all I could see was the hollow shell of a life I no longer recognized. I grabbed a vase, hurled it against the wall, watching it shatter. I tore down the few pictures I hadn't already broken, swept my arm across the countertop, sending everything crashing to the floor. It felt like the only way I could purge the betrayal from my heart. When the taxi arrived, I barely glanced back at the wreckage. I slid into the back seat, clutching my bag, feeling like a man who'd just woken up in a stranger's life. As we pulled away, I told the driver to take me to my grandmother's house in the village. It was the only place left where I might find a shred of peace. The drive to my grandmother's village felt like crossing into another world. The chaos of the city, the shouting, the humiliation, all of it slipped further away as the narrow, winding roads led me deeper into the quiet countryside. When the taxi finally pulled up to the old house, I stepped out and took a long, deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, damp air. It was silent here, eerily so, like even the world itself had chosen to give me a moment to catch my breath. I pushed open the door, feeling a rush of stale air and the thick scent of dust. Everything was covered in a fine layer of neglect. My grandmother has not lived here for many years, and although the family continued to maintain the house, no one came here often. I looked around, feeling the weight of solitude pressing in. It was lonely, yes, but it was also comforting in a strange way. I spent the afternoon cleaning, more to keep my mind busy than anything else. I scrubbed, swept, dusted every corner, letting the physical work distract me. But as soon as I sat down in the quiet living room, the silence pressed in, bringing the memories flooding back. I felt like I was tumbling through every moment, every small sign that I'd brushed off over the last month. Her sudden interest in Brian, the secretive smiles, the inside jokes, the time she laughed just a bit louder when he was around. The anger in me burned, but beneath it, a deep, crushing sadness seeped in, leaving me hollow. As dusk settled, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from her. "What have you done?" she wrote. "What did you do to my house?" I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to respond, to say everything I'd been holding back. But I resisted. I let the screen go dark and put the phone down. A minute later, it buzzed again, then another, and another, each message lighting up the room in brief flashes. each one taunting me. I tried to ignore it, but her persistence wore me down. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up the phone. There was a string of messages, each one more bitter than the last. And then came the one that stopped me cold. "Do you know why I cheated on you?" she began. "Because you're a pathetic loser. You were never as brave as your brother. Not as strong. Not as manly. You were always a nerd, and you still are. I wanted to tell you sooner, but it was already too late. Brian and I have been together for over a month now, and you never even noticed. That's because you're a nerd, a fool. We carried on right in front of you, and you didn't have a clue. I'm glad you're no longer my husband." I stared at the screen, each word etching itself deeper into my mind. I read it again, letting the venom sink in. My vision blurred, and my hand shook as I gripped the phone. I could hardly breathe. Her words cut deeper than anything I'd ever felt. Every moment between her and Brian flashed before me, each one landing like a blow, each memory twisting into something dark and ugly. I'd given her everything, and in return, she saw me as nothing. With trembling hands, I blocked her number, knowing I couldn't bear another word from her. I set the phone down, feeling as though I'd been emptied, hollowed out. The anger that had simmered inside me all night boiled over, and I let out a scream that echoed through the empty rooms. It was like I could hear my own heart breaking, each beat a reminder of everything she'd torn apart. But then, as the echo faded, a strange resolve settled over me. She'd mocked me, belittled me, and left me with nothing. And yet, in that raw, vulnerable place, something began to change. Her words, meant to crush me, had instead ignited a fire I didn't know I had. I was done being her fool. I was done being the man who didn't see what was happening around him. I had to change. I had to become someone who wouldn't be cast aside, who wouldn't be so easily betrayed. And when she finally saw me, when she finally understood what she'd thrown away, it would be too late. The pain wasn't gone, but it was replaced by something stronger, a fierce determination to rebuild myself, piece by piece. A month passed, but it felt like a lifetime since that night. In the quiet of my grandmother's house, I'd worked tirelessly on rebuilding myself, pouring my focus into plans and goals instead of letting my mind sink into the past. Kevin had come through for me more than I ever could have imagined. Within days of the scandal, he'd kicked Julia out of the office, making it clear that she had no place there anymore. He told me later that he couldn't stomach the idea of working with her, not after what she'd done. It was Kevin, too, who'd encouraged me to step up, who'd thrown opportunities my way I'd never dreamed of. And just like that, I'd gone from the guy at the desk to the new deputy boss. The boost in confidence, the promotion, it was surreal, but it was exactly the fuel I needed. For once, I was beginning to feel like I could stand on my own without looking over my shoulder. My life was starting to take shape in a way I hadn't foreseen. The idea of a startup had always been a distant dream, something I'd bring up half-heartedly, but never really pursue. But with Kevin's encouragement and my newfound drive, I threw myself into it. I stayed late every night, researching, networking, setting up meetings with potential investors. It was exhilarating to finally be in control of something. Everything seemed to fall into place. And yet, despite the satisfaction, despite the forward motion, the part of me that was still broken, still aching, wouldn't stay silent. As much as I tried to bury my thoughts, memories of Julia surfaced, unbidden, in the quiet moments when I was alone. It was the little things that caught me off guard, a laugh from across the room that sounded like hers, or the smell of her favorite perfume as someone walked past. Those moments brought everything flooding back. She'd betrayed me, humiliated me in ways I couldn't forget, but I'd loved her once, truly loved her. And, to my shame, some part of me still did. The feelings wouldn't vanish overnight, no matter how much I wished they would. I'd learned to be strong, to look at myself with more confidence, to lead with conviction. But there were nights when the house was silent, and that flickering hope in the back of my mind, a hope that she'd call, apologize, say it was all a mistake, crept in. It was ridiculous. I knew better than anyone that it was over, that I'd moved on to a better, brighter place. But that voice, that hopeful, foolish voice, refused to let me fully let go. Each day, I grew stronger. Each day, I poured more of myself into this new life, finding moments of pride I hadn't felt in years. My startup was gaining traction. People were beginning to take notice. Kevin had even mentioned investing if things continued to go well. And still, in the dark hours of the night, I found myself wondering if she ever thought of me, if she ever felt even a sliver of regret for what she'd done. I wanted her to see me now, to see the man I was becoming, a man who was finally finding his place, his ambition. But the hardest part, the part one wrestled with daily, was knowing that no amount of success could truly erase what had happened.